Hello Phoenix people and welcome to a new and exciting tutorial. Today I'm going to show you how you can import Chaos Phoenix caches inside of Unreal Engine 5.3. So let's get started. First, let's start with an empty Max scene and I'm going to create my favorite fire preset. And in order to be able to import Phoenix caches inside of Unreal, you'll need to export them into the OpenVDB format. So in order to do that, you need to go under the output rollout and we need to specify where we want to save our files. And in this case, I will create a new folder in here called fire, and then change my save type as .vdb, and let's call this fire. And because we don't want to simulate all the timeline in order to save some time, so I will simulate like 50 frames, for example, and let's start my simulation. And in case if you already have some simulations exported, simulated as the native Phoenix files, which are Aura, then you don't need to simulate them again. You can just convert them to the VDB format. And you can do that using the cache converter. So in this case, the cache converter can be found in here. It's in C, program files, chaos group, Phoenix FD, the folder of your Max. So if you have Max 2022, for example, it will be Max 2022. In this case, I'm using Max 2024. And in the bin folder, you have this cache converter. So it's a command line tool, but in case you're not comfortable working with command line tools, you can just drag and drop caches over here. So if you have a VDB cache and drag and drop it over the cache converter, it will start like so. And as you can see, it converted our file to Aura. And of course, it will work the exact same way for Aura files. You drag and drop it over the cache converter and it will convert it to a VDB file. So no need to export your files 2 times. Okay, so now that our simulation is done, let's go and see how it looks. We get something like this. So let's see how we can import it in Unreal. I have an empty default scene in Unreal Engine. And in this case, I'm using Unreal Engine version 5.30. Okay, so in order to import my files, I can just go in here to the folder where I have selected it, and for some reason drag and drop is not working. So let's import them over here from the import button, and let's import it. This will prompt us with a dialog where we can specify which channels that we wish to use. And we can see that it allows us to import this as a sequence. In this case, we want to import it as a sequence, but we don't need any of the velocity channels. So I'll set them to none and import it. This will create this animated sparse volume texture in here. And now, in order to be able to render it, we need a node that's called heterogeneous volume actor. So what I can do to create it is I can click on the plus sign and let's start typing. And in here we have the heterogeneous volume. I will add it to my scene. And then we need to assign a material. So for the material, unfortunately, Unreal is not providing default materials for volumes, and we need to create this by ourselves. I have already went ahead and prepared one, and if I double click on it, this is how it looks. It's a bit complex, so it's not a trivial thing to do, but if you go and check my description, I will link a video made by Winbush. He's an awesome YouTube creator, and he has a really nice and detailed tutorial and video step-by-step how you can create this shader. So my shader is almost exactly the same. I've just went ahead and renamed some of the nodes so that they make sense for the Phoenix workflow. And of course, if you don't want to go and build this shader by yourself, I will provide it in a link in the description where you can just download it, copy and paste it in your Unreal project file, and you can follow along. Okay, so now that we have this long explanation out of the way, I will go in here and find this param node. This is a sparse volume texture sample param node. And in here, we need to link our fire sparse volume texture. Now I have selected it. I need to press apply, click save, and let's close this one. Now I can right click over my Phoenix shader and let's create a material instance. I will call this fire shader. And then I will drag and drop it to my materials for the heterogeneous volume. Actually, I can select it, press F2, and let's call this fire so that it's a bit easier to find. And now nothing happens. Nothing happens because we're still on frame 0. And if I scroll down a bit in here, under the animation, we can go in here and dial frame 50, for example. And if we dial frame 50, again, nothing happens. So that's because we still need to tweak our fire shader in order to show up. So let me double click over my fire shader. And in here, we have some options. So I will click on the fire and we need to increase the multiplier a lot. So I have found that values of 2000 or something are kind of working. So actually, let me set this to playing, and something is wrong and my fire shader is not working. So let me see if I have linked the correct thing. Yes, I did not link my correct thing. My shader is looking for the blue channel, and I'll show you in a bit how you can use that. So let's hit apply, hit save, and now our fire is showing. Okay, now if we go back to our fire shader, in here we can adjust the intensity of the fire, and you can see this is what we get. Actually, I can press G on my keyboard and this will hide the helpers, and we can see our fire better, like so, and we can adjust the settings like so. A common thing with the caches coming from Phoenix is that the temperature in Phoenix usually goes from 300 to 1000. So we'll need to remap our temperature in order to be looking correctly. Why is that? So if I go in here, you can see that we have some predefined values for our temperature. And if I set this to 0 and 1, like most of the VDB caches coming from other software look like, we get something like this. And this is not really the correct result that we are after. And if you're wondering what values you should use for the input low and input high, we can go in here in our 3D Studio Max, and I can expand the simulation route, and we can see that our cache in here has values between 300 and 2000 for our temperature. So in order to use them in Unreal, we have this remapping. So in here for the input low, I will say we need 300, and for the input high, in this case, we have 2000, and we're getting the correct result. And what happens is Unreal expects the values for temperature to be in the range from 0 to 1. So we are remapping 300 to become 0 and 2000 to become 1. And of course, we can play around with these values and clamp some of the minimum temperature, and we can see that we're getting something closer to what we have inside of 3ds Max. Okay, so far so good, but we have no smoke and we have no additional channels. So the next thing that I want to show you is how we can use caches that contain smoke and fuel, which is a bit different than the temperature. So I will select my fire, and let's stop the loop and let's stop the playing. Actually, let's hide this. And what I did ahead of time is just went over here and simulated a gasoline explosion preset. And if I go in here in my input world, I can show you how this looks. So I can import the caches, and if we scroll over here, this is the simulation that we have from the gasoline explosion preset. In case if you want to follow along, you can just create a gasoline explosion preset, go to the output route and save this as a VDB sequence, and then just run your sim. So I went and did this ahead of time, so we don't have to wait. And let's go in here and import this. So I'll import this like so. And in here, we have a bit more channels to work with. So in this case, let's keep the temperature as our red channel. Our smoke will be our green, but for the blue in here, I will choose my fuel, and then we'll set all of the other channels to none. And again, we're importing this as a sequence. So I will import this. Okay, and we have it over here. So now we need to link our Phoenix shader to use the explosion over here. So let's go, and for the param node, let's go and pick our explosion. I'll apply and save it. And now we need to create another heterogeneous volume. So I will create one over here, and let's duplicate our Phoenix shader. So I will create a material instance, and then I will call this explosion shader. Okay, then let's link it to the materials over here, and I will pick frame 30, for example. And we can see that our volume showed up. Okay, and now if we start playing, we get something like this. Quick intermission from the future. You'll notice that once I turn on the animation for the volume, it starts jittering and sliding a bit to the sides. I'll show you how you can fix that by turning off the adaptive grid in the later part of the video. But in case you want to skip to this part right now, you can check the timestamps below. And that's it. Let's continue with the video. Okay, cool. But we have no fire. What happened? Again, we need to go and adjust our settings a bit. So I will stop the looping and let's go and open our explosion shader. And just as before, let's enable the fire and bump it up to 1000 or like 2000. Yeah, looking cool. And if I enable the animation, we get something like this. Okay, so far so good, but this doesn't look like the animation we have in Max. Let me disable the looping for now and let's get back to Max. In here, we can see that our fire is spread through the smoke, and in here in Unreal, it's way too uniform. That's because if we get back in Max and if we go under our rendering route and go under the volumetric options, and for the fire, we can see that our fire is based on the fuel channel and not on temperature. If I go and pick my temperature, you can see that we have something that is mimicking what we have in Unreal right now. And if we get back to the fuel, we get something like this. So in order to be able to achieve this result in Unreal, we'll need to use our fuel channel. So if you remember, we have imported our fuel channel in the blue channel of our sparse volume texture. So in order to use it, we'll need to go back in our Phoenix shader, like so, and we'll need to switch our channel for the temperature over here to be using the blue channel of our sparse volume texture. So in this case, I will disable the red over here, enable the blue, hit apply, hit save, and we can see that we have nothing. So that's because the fuel channel is using range from 0 to 1 compared to the temperature. If we go in Max over here, and I go under my simulation rod, we can see that our fuel is in the range of 0 to almost 1. So what we need to do here is let's go and open our explosion shader, because this is responsible for our explosion. And in here, we need to change our input low and input high. So let's set our input low to 0 and input high to 1. And we can see that something starts to show, but our fire multiplier is still not high enough. So let's bump it up. And we can see that we now have something showing. And now, if I loop this, we can see that we have this nice and explosive shader. And if we go in here and let's pick frame 30, for example, we have something like this. And the other things that you can do with the Phoenix shader is, of course, if you click on the smoke, you can lower the amount of smoke and disable it altogether, and we're left only with the fire. So, and if we increase it a bit, like so, we can start and introduce some back some of the smoke. In case if you don't want any fire at all, you can just set the fire to 0 and you'll get something like this. And we can introduce some of our fire. We can also play around with the black body multiplier, which will increase our fire intensity, like so. We can get something like this. And of course, if you want thicker smoke, you can go way above 1. So I can set it to 2 and we'll get a bit more thicker smoke. Okay. And finally, we can change our smoke color to be something more dusty, for example. This is way too saturated, but we can do something like this. And we have something like a dust explosion. And we can play it and loop it. And the next thing that I want to show you is you can notice that our volume is not casting any shadows. And the lighting in here is not very realistic. That's because by default, these things won't work. In case we want to use them, we need to enable the path tracing. So let me go and disable the looping and stop playing. Now we can go in here in the menu lid, and I can enable the path tracing. And immediately you'll notice that nothing happens. So that's because in order to be able to render the sparse volume textures in the path tracer, you need to use an environment variable. So the way to enable it is really simple. So let me switch to lid. And what we can do is go in here under this console command window, and I can start typing r.path tracing heterogeneous volumes. Select that, press space, and set this to 1, which means enabled. So enter it, and now if we go and enable our path tracing, we can see our volume. And if I rotate my camera around, you'll see that it's casting shadows. But as you can see, it's a lot slower compared to the native default renderer. And in this case, if we go and change our smoke color to something like white, for example, make it really white, and disable the fire, we can get really nice cloudy look. And let me hide the floor, for example, so that it doesn't get in the way. And you can see that we're getting these nice clouds, but as you can see, it's really, really slow. Of course, my GPU, it's not that powerful. I'm using 2060 Super, so a bit an older medium GPU, nothing fancy. I suspect that it will be faster on a more modern one, like 4090, for example. But yeah, in case if you want to use shadows and proper scattering for the volume, you need to use the path tracing mode. So, and the final thing that I want to show you is, let me go back in here and enable my fire. Actually, let's lower our smoke to 0.5. Okay, and if I go in here for not my fire, but this is my explosion, and if I start playing it, you'll notice that it's flickering and it's sliding a bit to the side. That's because Unreal doesn't really like simulations with adaptive grid. And what we need to do is go back and simulate our simulation inside of Phoenix using a static grid. So how do you do that? Let me stop this and go back to our Macs. And by default, if you're using the gasoline explosion or any of the presets, if we go under the grid settings, we can see that in here we have the adaptive grid enabled. So in order to be able to load this in Unreal without any issues, you can disable the adaptive grid and adjust the grid size of your simulator to be larger so that it can fit your simulation. So I have already done that, and I have simulated the result. And let me go and import this inside of Unreal and show you how it looks. So I can go in here and import this, and I have an explosion using static grid. So let me go and import this, and in here we can use the fuel for the blue channel, and we won't use any of these velocities. So let's import this. Then let's go under our Phoenix shader and let's select our param node and pick our explosion static grid, press apply, press save. And then what we can do is hide this, and let's create another heterogeneous volume over here. Then let's apply an explosion shader to it, and let's start playing. And if I move it over here, you can see that it's no longer sliding and it looks correctly. Okay guys, I hope this video was useful, and today we went over on how to import Chaos Phoenix simulations inside of Unreal Engine 5.3. If you enjoyed this video, press the like button. If you want to see more, subscribe to my channel, and let me know what you want to see next in the comments. Thanks guys, and see you in the next one. Bye bye.